Welcome to Deconstructing Academic Standards, your step-by-step guide to unpacking Georgia standards. Deconstructing academic standards focuses on breaking down complex educational goals into manageable components. This ensures that classroom instruction is aligned with measurable learning targets and enhances student engagement. This guide is designed to support you in facilitating learning sessions that align with Georgia standards and in unpacking standards into appropriate learning targets and I can statements. We begin the process by reading content standards thoroughly and carefully, identifying essential verbs and nouns to illuminate the key components for effective lesson planning and student understanding in alignment with Georgia standards. Next, we analyze the cognitive demand of the identified verbs using Bloom's taxonomy or depth of knowledge to classify levels of understanding required for various instructional activities. Then, we break the standards down into smaller, more manageable content chunks. This ensures logical sequencing for instruction and enhances student comprehension, promoting engagement through clear learning pathways. Finally, we translate our identified chunks into clear, student-friendly I can statements and learning targets that are measurable, and these serve as our guide for students to understand their learning and their success criteria. The goal of deconstruction is to break down a single complex Georgia standard into its fundamental components: the what, which is the content, and the how, which is the skill or the cognitive demand. Now we'll look more closely at step 1, reading and highlighting. This step involves identifying the key components of standards, focusing on verbs that indicate skills and nouns that represent content. This foundational step will shape effective lesson planning as well as the student engagement strategies that you select when you're planning your lessons. The first step here is to analyze the full standard text. This ensures we aren't relying on abbreviated versions and that we capture the full intent of the standard itself. Step 2 is determining cognitive demand levels. In order to do this efficiently, we must understand Bloom's taxonomy and depth of knowledge. These frameworks are essential for aligning appropriate instructional activities. By categorizing verbs, we can tailor lessons to enhance cognitive rigor and promote deeper student engagement. Once the skill or the verb is identified, teachers must determine the required level of student thinking, which dictates the rigor of the instructional tasks. In step 3, we isolate content and create learning targets. By breaking down broad standards into smaller, more manageable pieces, we allow for more effective instruction by writing clear I can statements and learning targets. We transform our chunked standards into measurable targets, thereby optimizing student understanding and engagement. The content, or the nouns, may be too broad or numerous to teach in a single lesson. When we deconstruct the nouns, if there are multiple concepts or nouns, we list them separately. These become the individual learning targets, or chunks of content. When we sequence the chunks, we determine the logical teaching sequence. Sometimes content must be taught before the skill can be applied. For example, students must know the causes before they can explain them. Finally, in step 4, we develop the I can statements, or learning targets, that will serve as our guide throughout every learning session. I can statements are important because measurable learning targets empower students by clarifying their expectations. They facilitate engagement and ownership, enabling learners to understand their progress and fostering greater accountability in their educational journey. The goal here is to unpack standards into appropriate learning targets and I can statements. This step translates the rigor and content into clear, student-facing goals. The formula for an I can statement is to combine the manageable content chunks from step 3 with a simple, measurable verb. We must ensure that the statement is observable and measurable. If we cannot see or hear evidence of the I can, it needs to be revised. Once we've deconstructed standards, chunked the content, and created I can statements or learning targets to guide us through instruction and learning sessions, we must also decide how we will measure whether students have learned what we intended. This step addresses the question, what will students be able to produce or do to prove they have mastered this standard? This evidence is the starting point for developing your standards-aligned tasks and your formative or summative assessments. The evidence must always align directly with a cognitive verb identified in the standard. A standard using the verb analyze requires evidence of analysis, not just recall. Next, we must determine the product that will serve as evidence of mastery. If the I can statement is I can explain, which requires understanding, the evidence might be a written paragraph, a verbal summary to a partner, or a labeled flowchart. If the I can statement is I can compare, which requires analysis, the evidence might be a Venn diagram, a T-chart, or a comparative essay. When standards are deconstructed using the evidence as the end goal, teachers can plan the instructional pathway by selecting strategies that align evidence-based instructional strategies that will best help their student acquire their specific content and give them opportunities to practice the required skill. Click just below the words instructional strategies for Marzano's list of high-yield instructional strategies. The final step in this process is planning support for students with varied needs, such as scaffolding and extension for rigor. How will you support the content and skill for students who are struggling? How will you extend the learning for students who master the core target quickly? As your instructional lead teacher, supporting you and your team in increasing instructional rigor is the key priority and one of the most high-impact strategies that I can implement for ensuring standards-aligned tasks and increasing the depth of student thinking is the effective process of deconstructing standards. Thank you for your time. And for examples and standards we've previously deconstructed together, please click Winston K-5 Deconstructed Standards Example. If you have any questions whatsoever, comments, or would like to further this discussion, please don't hesitate to reach out to me.